web of conspiracy. Here is your host, Adam Webb.
Hello, and welcome to another exciting edition of the Web of Conspiracy. I am your host, Adam Webb. It's great to be back with you again this week, on time this week, too, with any luck, hopefully. Keep my fingers crossed. Haven't made it through the podcast yet. But once again, welcome, and thank you to all of you who continue to support the show, as well as welcome to all the new listeners. The last few weeks I've had quite the spike in listenership, so once again, thank you. I appreciate it. A few announcements before I get into some of the content of today's show. For those of you who don't follow the show on social media, please do so. I try to post some things on there from time to time, and certainly last week there was a YouTube clip that I had failed to mention during my podcast that I don't know how I failed to mention, but I did. And I wanted to mention that and also notify everybody that I had a link up there on Facebook, as well as I think I also tweeted it out and put on Google Plus as well. So if you're not a fan of the show on Facebook or Twitter or Google Plus, do so. Occasionally I do get on there and I try to be a little active, and certainly to any of you who send me messages or comments, I certainly try to give feedback as much as possible. So by all means, feel free to like the page on Facebook, follow on Twitter and Google Plus and all that good stuff. So I had a really cool video. Now look, I'm not a video expert, so for those of you who may be, and feel free to tear the video apart, then please do so. That being said, it was an interesting video posted of the... now, for those of you who are really young and do not remember, there was a time when TV shows and TV networks actually went off the air. They didn't air hundreds of crappy infomercials or anything like that, right? They actually went off the air, and there was either a no signal or it was a snow, what we used to refer to as snow, which I don't even know if kids even know what that is these days. Nevertheless, and even though I'm not all that particularly old, I do remember a time when this occurred. So that being said, a lot of stations, when they would start to go off the air, they would air a video montage and play the national anthem as they proceeded to go off the air. And while the national anthem would be playing, you'd be seeing images of the nation in the background, some of our natural landmarks, some of our man-made landmarks, the Statue of Liberty, things like that. Then along the bottom, and I do remember this specifically, the words of the national anthem would scroll along the bottom. There's a video, and look, you can question the authenticity. By all means, please feel free to do so. And if you believe that this is something that's been edited and tinkered with, I would love to get some feedback on that. As I have stated many times and will continue to express, I'm not a video expert. But when I do find something compelling or something interesting or something that at least it perhaps is a very good fake, then it's going to catch my attention and make me question it, or at least certainly pique my interest. Nevertheless, this video, as it's scrolling the lyrics to the national anthem, there appears to be, when it's going at regular full speed, it appears, and it's hard to really see at first, that there's some kind of lettering going out for it before the actual lyrics come across. And then as the video is replayed much slower, these words become to be very clear and would seem to indicate perhaps that there was some sort of brainwashing attempts in this to more or less brainwash audience into government obedience and that kind of thing. It's an interesting video, so I put it out there. Feel free to check it out. Let me know what you think. If you think it's bogus, if you think it's garbage, let me know. I welcome the feedback. It's not my video, so I'm not attached to it necessarily. It was interesting enough and compelling enough to make me put it out there. And being the fact that I'm not an expert, looking at it, if this is a forgery, it's done very well. I certainly couldn't tell. To me, it looked fairly authentic. So it also lines up with very much of the 1960s CIA. There's much documented evidence. The CIA investigated and went to a number of bizarre methods, particularly talking telekinesis. They certainly did plenty of experiments on that. That is documented. That is not just some sort of conspiracy theory. That is known. They delved into some of more of the psychic nature of things, and certainly into mind control and understanding how people behave in groups and how to better manipulate those groups. Those are all things that the CIA very actively engaged in. So that video, to me, certainly seems to argue that, okay, this is not that far out of the question, and this falls very much in line with what my belief of what most of the so to speak lesser visible aspects of our government are engaged in. Now, so check those out. I have that on the page on Facebook, and I tweeted a link out, and it's also on Google+. So check that out. Let me know what you think. Also, for those of you listening to the show, I mean, there's done tons of ways at this point now. I have a dedicated YouTube channel, which I post basically upload as soon as I upload the show. It's also available on YouTube. It's also available to download on iTunes, as well as to listen to on demand both on Spreaker, which is my main distributor, as well as on Stitcher, who also distributes the show for me. And I've developed a little bit of an audience in Stitcher as well. So the thing I would ask of any of you, no matter what method you listen to the show, is please feel free to write a review on the show via, whether it's on iTunes or Stitcher, on the page, review the show. Let other people know what you think. Let me know what you think of the show. That way I can certainly look to improve and maybe go into some different directions or cover topics that maybe I don't cover enough of. I welcome that feedback. So that being said, please feel free to do so. The more you review, the higher the show gets in terms of notice from the distributors, and then the show ends up getting spotlighted, and I get a chance to reach even a bigger audience. And that's ultimately my goal. No matter where I go with this show, I want to be able to reach as many people as possible. I can tell you that in almost a year's time, it'll be a year in November, since I started here on Spreaker, that I reach far more people than I ever thought I would. And I've had far more people listen to the show than I ever dreamed they would. So thank you for that. And it certainly is the thing that throughout this year, which has been a very trying year, for those of you who've been on board with me from the beginning through my cancer diagnosis, through the surgeries, through what is hopefully now my complete recovery, it's been a trying year. And as a result, there have been some times the effort to research and put together the show does take a little bit out of me, as well as do all the other things outside of the show that I do. So that being said, it does take some effort. So I do appreciate any feedback I can get with regards to the quality of the show, as it's something that I am desperately trying to improve. Now, building on that, I had mentioned last week that I'm debating and floating around the possibility of a money bomb. I would welcome your feedback as an audience once again. As I stated, I've had some tech issues, I've had some things go on, and there is a cost in producing this show. While I try to do it as minimally as possible so that I can continue to produce the show, I also want to be able to expand the show. I want to be able to do more. And to be able to do that, I need to be able to generate at least a little bit of money out of this, if at all possible. If not, then I will continue to produce the show as it is, and nothing more will come of it. But I would welcome feedback from the audience as to whether or not this would be something that you'd be supportive of. Because if I'm not going to go through the effort of initializing a Moneyball campaign and nobody bother. And being honest, it's a waste of my time, it's a waste of your time, it's a waste of everybody's time. So if it's something that you would be willing to, and I'm not asking for a $100 check from anybody, that's obscene. But what I am saying is that if you can donate a couple bucks, whatever, $5 even, whatever, I would welcome it to be able to get some additional equipment, as well as even, be able to have some dedicated lines for the network that I'm creating, and be able to do a little bit more with the show, to be able to really improve the quality. And that's my goal. That's my plan. That's what I want to do. And I want to be able to even, I've had one guest on the show. I want to be able to expand that. I want to make that a little bit easier, and I want to improve the quality of that as well. So by all means, I would welcome your feedback, because if nobody is going to support the idea of a money bomb, please let me know, and I'm not going to go through the effort of creating a campaign. So whatever feedback you can give me, I would appreciate there as well. Now, before I get into the news, this episode is going to be a little different in terms of content. In the old show that I did last October, I for those of you who actually know me personally, and there's a few of you out there who listen to the show that know me personally, you know that October is one of my favorite months. I love Halloween. I love the horror movies. I love scary movies. So what I try to do this past October and what I'm doing this October is I wanted to be able to bring out, I guess, what I would consider more Halloween-themed topics that are a little bit more in line with what you see this time of year. So that being said, this episode, along with the next 2 episodes that I do, are going to be very Halloween-themed type of episodes. Today's show, of course, is about werewolves, and I'll get into the meat of that topic. But next week, I plan on doing a show about the Ouija board. Of course, there's a new Ouija movie that's coming out, so that will certainly be discussed. And then the following week, on Halloween, I plan on getting into the vampire lore. Both werewolves and vampires are something, as a kid, I always thought were fascinating, great movies, and some of my favorites come from those genres. So I want to be able to get into that as well. So yes, it's going to be a little different than some of the stuff that I've done, but nevertheless, I think that there is content here, and I think there's a discussion to be had certainly about the Ouija board, and even about the other 2 creatures, which are considered mythical, but there's tons of lore on. So I want to be able to get into that as well, into discussing whether or not these creatures do exist, or if they maybe even ever did exist. So that's the plan for the rest of the month of October. And as I said, a little different, but I'm certainly still going to cover some of the typical topics that I have been, for a while. And certainly in the news, when I do come over some news highlights, I'll continue to do that as I always have been. Speaking of which, of course, the main topic that's dominating right now, at least certainly in the United States, and I imagine even globally, is the Ebola scare, the Ebola crisis. Of course, the first patient diagnosed with it in the United States, Mr. Duncan, passed away on, I believe, a day or 2 ago at this point of the recording. Now, he passed away from the virus in Dallas, Texas. And of course, at this point, of course, the fear is starting to spread. And if you go on the social medias, you can tell. People are becoming more and more scared. I think some of it's legitimate. I really do. And while I try not to be a fearmonger, and that's never been the intention of this show, I think it's important that everybody is very aware of the dangers of this virus, as well as the highly likely possibility that this virus will mutate. It will have to mutate to survive in the United States. It will not survive in its current form unless it does. And the prime directive of every living organism is to live, to find a way to survive. That is what we do. That is our inherent instinct, is to find a way to survive, to adapt to our conditions. Whatever the conditions may be, if we wish to survive, we have to learn to adapt. The virus is no different. Regardless of how simplistic the organism is, it is no different. And it will find a way to survive and thrive in the United States, which means that this will most likely mutate and become yet another strain of the virus and become even more difficult to treat and prevent, as well as potentially cure an individual of. That being said, of course, the CDC is commenting that there's nothing to fear. We have this under control, yet some of their actions certainly seem to indicate otherwise. And I mentioned that in last week's show. I am no way convinced the CDC has this handled whatsoever. This has gotten out of control. And certainly, they're making some efforts now in certain airports to be a little more careful in terms of having passengers coming from West Africa. A little overdue, if you ask me. Nevertheless, look, I get it. Nobody wants to have to go through all the screening measures that has to be done, but the best chance of being able to prevent this from spreading worldwide is as if this is done worldwide. If everybody prevents travel, and at least certainly does their efforts to prevent individuals who are potentially ill from being able to transport this disease. No, it's in certainly the Spanish nurse now who has been diagnosed, and they wound up putting down the poor dog, which who knows whether the dog had it or not, but the dog got put down because of the fear that the dog may have had Ebola and then may spread Ebola. This is a legitimate concern. As I stated, I don't want to start a panic, but we need to be prepared and we need to be cautious. Building on this, I know I've seen it out there in a few places, so I'm putting it out here for everybody to listen to. You know, the United States government has a number of contracts out with pharmaceutical companies to develop a vaccine, which, as I've stated a few weeks ago, most of you know that I believe that there is, and I stand by that. I stand by that belief. I believe that it is secured and that only certain individuals are getting it. And you notice that, of course, the one death thus far from all of the patients who have come to the United States for treatment was from the one person who is not an American. Okay? And so, yes, I'm a little suspicious. I am more than a little suspicious at this point as to whether or not, of course, that Mr. Duncan was given the actual known treatment that the others were. I'm skeptical of that. Regardless of what's being reported in the media, I am skeptical of this. Interestingly enough, one of the pharmaceutical companies who was tasked, who has what they believe is one potential vaccine, the moment that Mr. Duncan was diagnosed on U.S. soil, their stock price rose in one day, I believe, 16%. Some kind of crazy number in one day. This company, Techmira Pharmaceuticals, over the year to date, their stock has risen almost 200%. Almost 200%. And look, I'm not anti-capitalist by any means. If you can make money, feel free to go out and make money. Okay? But I have to admit that there is a certain nauseating factor knowing that there are people who are making millions on and made a 16% gain on their investment because one man was diagnosed with Ebola. I mean, within moments of his diagnosis being announced, that stock jumped. Now, that being said, the moment the man passed away, their stock lost almost all those gains. So yes, there's an evening out of that. But despite all of that, despite that roller coaster, that stock is still up almost 200%. So yes, people are making money on other people becoming ill. And unfortunately, it's been happening for decades now. And certainly I could do an entire show on the pharmaceutical companies, and we could question all day long about whether or not pharmaceuticals are actually effective, if they make things worse, if they don't. You have plenty of people who advocate for holistic treatments, plenty who advocate for both, some who it's all over the place. So you can pick your camp and believe what you want. There is no, unfortunately, it's just the definitive proof. What is there is being repressed anyways. So it's unfortunate that we have people who are becoming millionaires on the misfortunes of others. Unfortunately, that has been going on for a long time. Nevertheless, where are we? I don't know. I don't know if any of this is going to matter. I don't know. I have to imagine at some point the treatment will actually become mainstream, but for the time being, I think it's still being very, very guarded. Now, all of this media attention that certainly Ebola is getting, and certainly the ongoing campaign against ISIS or ISIL, however you want to refer to them, is going on. You have all this going on in the background. Yet, two things that struck me over the last week or so is that, for some reason, we're not hearing anything about the two unfortunate Malaysian Airlines incidents anymore. They have been completely forgotten about from the mainstream media. Nobody cares that we've still never found any sign of the missing airliner. And nobody seems to be all too concerned about whether or not any sort of accountability is held for the airliner that was shot down over the Ukraine. And for all the lives that have been confirmed lost there. It's like, okay, well, it's yesterday's news. We're on to Ebola now. we're on to ISIS now. And while those things are important, I do find it interesting that that's been completely forgotten about. And it's unfortunate. So, there's your upbeat news for the day. I have to tell you that, I don't know, doing the news like that and covering some of these news topics, while I feel it's important, at the same time, it can be very deflating and very disorienting. But I feel like it needs to be, certainly some items need to be discussed. And kind of moving on into some more of the weird news, I don't know how many of you pay attention or monitor, and I'm not going to go into specific incidents, but there have been a number of fairly prominent UFO sightings that are being documented throughout YouTube in the last month or so. It seems as if though there's been this huge spike with a number of strange incidents, and of course happening around metro areas. I know there's one that perhaps looks like it's probably a drone over Hong Kong, certainly with the protests going on there. And of course, those protests related to more democratic freedoms. But there's been a huge spike in UFO activity. So something to monitor for those of you who are interested. And I know Huffington Post, I think, in their UFO news page has put a few different ones up there. So I might try to link to a couple of those later on. But check those out if you have some time. But there's some interesting increase, it seems, in the number of UFO sightings in the last month or so. Now, having said, having all this other news, I really wanted to, because of how much I love the month of October, I love the Halloween season, I really wanted to get into, I guess, a little more lighthearted, so to speak, topics. I wanted to get into something a little more fun. This is a little bit of a break for me, as well as, and I shouldn't say a break so much, it's more of a mental break in that I'm not always reading about or thinking about all the ways that things are going wrong, but kind of just losing myself into lore that is intriguing and perhaps has something more to it. So for today, I decided I wanted to get into the werewolf topic. Now, there are a number of modern-day werewolf stories, which to many might surprise. The Dogmen of Michigan, the Beast of Bray Road in Wisconsin. There's a number of active sightings and investigators who are researching this kind of phenomena. So as much as everyone wants to think that this is just a Hollywood tale, or this is just, this is ancient European folklore and it's making its way this way, well, that's not necessarily the case. There seems to be something going on here, and there are some who think, well, perhaps it's Sasquatch related. I'm not sure, but nevertheless, this is a current phenomenon. So before you dismiss this as just being a Hollywood type of thing, it's not. There are a number of people, Raven Mindell being one, who is actively investigating the Dogmen of Michigan. There are a number of investigators out there who are trying to find out what is going on with these sightings, because people are seeing what appear to be werewolf type of creatures. They see them hunched over on all fours. They'll see them get up on the hind legs. They have dog type of faces. But yet they're, in many cases, 6 feet tall or bigger, much bigger. So there is something here. There is. Now, the question is, is this just something that's being misidentified? Well, I don't know. Is this something that's just a fanciful legend? Well, look, the legend and the lore of werewolves, they go back thousands of years. We're talking about into a time when ancient man established animal cults and would worship animals, and one of those certainly being the werewolf, being the wolf. Okay, the wolf is a prominent part of the history of man, and the reason we have dogs is because we have wolves. The wolves who coordinated with us in the hunt, when humans would go out in packs and wolves would go out in packs, the ones who were less afraid of man and were willing to coordinate and were not as aggressive towards man, wound up being the dogs that we have today. Eventually were bred into these dogs, and these wolves would not only help in hunting, but they would also help in protection. They would ward off other wolves because they would have established this as their pack. So they would be able to be an alarm, so to speak, much in the way of that many people have dogs for protection now, to sound alarms, to bark when there's an intruder, but they would ward off these wolves that would try to come in and take from tribes in the night. So it wound up being a symbiotic type of relationship. So that is somewhat of the beginning, in my opinion, of where this starts. They're long intertwined with humanity. And stories of human transformation into wolves are found in a number of cultures. We're talking Greek, Norse mythology, Scandinavian, this Icelandic, Germanic lore. All throughout Europe, there are stories of people who would transform. Now, some of the legends describe the werewolf as someone who was born with the curse and then transforms when the moon is full, much like we would see in Hollywood. And then, of course, the other flip side is that other tales are that a werewolf is a witch that transforms using magic or through the aid of demons, which is something that you don't hear as much. And, of course, there's the lore in which people who have survived a werewolf attack then would become a werewolf. That is perhaps the most prominent throughout Hollywood. One of my favorite movies of all time, which now is a little dated, but still a great movie, in my opinion, American Werewolf in London. One of my favorites, and that is an indication of a reflection of the idea that if you survive the attack, you will then become the creature once the next full moon occurs. Now, werewolf beliefs, of course, as stated, have been popular throughout Europe. France has numerous stories of wolves that terrorize the countryside, such as the beast of, bear with me because I do not do French, beast of Gévaudan, I believe is how it's pronounced, that was attacking this small village in France in, I believe it was the 15th or 16th century. And then, of course, in England, wolves were basically exterminated by the 16th century, and some of this out of these general fears as well. Now, the type of werewolves, of course, I've discussed this a little bit, but of course, there's the involuntary. These are the ones that it's believed that they were cursed, and either some of the lore says that there's a actual specific timeline, that there's a set number of years that someone will experience the curse of the werewolf, and then one day the curse will be lifted. And there's others that say, no, once you have the curse of the werewolf, it's a lifetime curse. Certainly some of the old lore going back, those are some of the variations there. Now, there is Armenian lore, okay, that says that a sinful woman is condemned to be a werewolf for 7 years. So there's one example of this relegated timeline, okay? This woman, if she commits too much sin, well, she'll be a werewolf for a period of 7 years as penance for her sin. Of course, very different than what we see in the Hollywood stories and things of that nature, okay? Then there is the voluntary werewolf, and this is a person who likes to eat human flesh and acquires these magical skills through the flesh that allow them to transform at will, okay? Many cultures have this idea that human flesh contains a certain power, a certain magic to it, that if you consume the flesh of another human, you obtain their qualities, you obtain their strength, their spirit, so to speak. You yourself become stronger by consuming their flesh. Very kind of creepy, and certainly not my thing, but going back into the medieval times and certainly earlier, this idea of consuming human flesh, well, unfortunately, it happened at least a little more regularly. And of course, there are entire tribes today, even still, there's tribes that believe in the power of consuming human flesh. And of course, as I'd mentioned, there are those who are the involuntary who survive, the survivors of the attacks, right? And they then become marked with the curse of the werewolf. Now, the characteristics of the werewolf, okay? They have a desire for flesh and blood of humans and animals. They'll eat other animals as well, going into the belief of the werewolf lore. They have an insatiable sexual lust, okay? And of course, that is often depicted very clearly in Hollywood. It's a great selling feature, right? And then they developed wolfish type of behavior. They would howl. They would run around on all fours. And then, of course, it would culminate with attacks on humans and animals. And many would claim that they would look werewolfish. They would take on wolf-like features. So, very bizarre kind of phenomenon. And there's a number of stories throughout history in which this was believed to be true. Now, there is also a connection between werewolves and ghosts. There are some that contend that werewolves are like ghosts. They can appear and disappear at will. That a number of these phantom sightings had been reported in England, including a relatively recent report in 1972. There was a story of this werewolf that could appear and disappear in this village. And as I had mentioned, werewolves had been hunted practically to extinction, or wolves had been... Werewolves, yeah, well, then that would have been certainly documented. Wolves had been hunted to extinction in England. So the fact that there was a sighting in 1972, well, maybe there was a wolf still, even though I believe there's still some numbers, but perhaps, in fact, this was just a misidentification. But this individual believed that it just disappeared. They watched it more or less dematerialize. So there does seem to be some reports that it has some sort of ghost-like capabilities. Then there's, of course, the connection of werewolves and witchcraft, and I had just discussed this briefly, but both were seen as servants of Satan during the Inquisition. Okay, the idea that witches we've certainly heard much of during the Inquisition, but there were also a number of werewolves, and they were given the same treatment. And during the peak of the Inquisition, those who were accused of being a werewolf were believed to have their pelts on the inside of their bodies, so that inside of the human flesh there were their wolf pelts, their wolf skin, their wolf hair, all that. So authorities would cut off all the limbs of these people who were accused of being werewolves to determine if the individual was in fact a werewolf. Well, talk about a fun procedure, right? And of course, people did not survive this. They would bleed out, and then they'd find out all too late that, I guess they weren't a werewolf after all. Oh. My guess is that in many cases, once they'd cut off all the limbs, they would try to find some kind of way to prove that, in fact, this was a werewolf. Now, interestingly enough, there is another term that is often associated with the werewolf phenomenon, and that's known as lycanthropy. And this is a medical condition in which people believe that they are actually wolves. That these are individuals who suffer from some sort of mental illness and have begun taking on wolf-type behaviors, and even try to look more like wolves, move around on all fours. How some of the things that were mentioned in the ancient lore, there are people who, with this particular mental illness that is described as lycanthropy, believe they are wolves. They don't necessarily shapeshift or turn into a wolf, right, or become this huge wolf man type creature, but they just take on the personality of a wolf because that is what they believe they are. They believe they are werewolves. I've never met anybody with that type of particular mental illness, but I do know, and I have seen some documented cases of that. Even today, there are people who, and some of this, of course, I believe is even further fanned by the Hollywood machine and the werewolf movies, and people who became so fascinated with these that they began to obsess and then begin to take on these ideas of what they believe a werewolf should be. So in that respect, werewolves, to a degree, are real, right? There are people who believe that they are wolves, okay? There is an offshoot to the werewolf phenomenon that I do think we need to talk about a little bit if we're going to discuss werewolves, and that's shapeshifters and skinwalkers. Now, shapeshifters, of course, they're also prominent in many of the same cultures that the werewolf myth is. Shapeshifting myths were recorded even in antiquity. Writers such as Homer, Virgil, Herodotus, Ovid all wrote about people who had this ability to shift into other animals, and many of which would prefer to shift into a wolf type of form. Nordic and Icelandic lore, they speak of the, here we go again, the Ergi Einhamen, I believe is how it's pronounced, and that translates into not of one skin, okay, that they could move and change their skin into another form, another animal, something along those lines. And there's other stories of humans taking on animal shape that persist throughout Southeast Asia, as well as into Russia. And there are also stories that link shapeshifters to witchcraft as well, much as the werewolf lore during the Inquisition was also linked to witchcraft. Okay, so we have lore of shapeshifters going throughout Asia, Russia, Europe, all over the place. So between the werewolf phenomenon and the shapeshifter phenomenon, well, it's all over Europe, all over Asia. We're talking several different cultures that believed that humans could transform themselves into another creature. Now, I have yet to get into the next one, skinwalkers. And skinwalkers is perhaps the Native American, the American representative in this particular discussion. Navajo lore believed that witches and sorcerers could shift into wolves or coyotes or birds or other animals. First, one of these individuals, they would have to become a witch by killing a family member before they could turn into skinwalkers. They would travel at great speeds, and they would be often invisible. You couldn't see the skinwalkers. And they are said to gather in caves at night, and they would initiate other members, and they would practice magic and cannibalism, and then they would have sex with female corpses. So the Navajo lore is pretty gruesome in terms of the creation of a skinwalker. And that is, in many respects, I would say, the American werewolf, the idea that we see in Europe and Asia. This is very much the American response to this. Now, there's so much lore. The question then becomes, did they exist? Or, and for that matter, do they exist? There are a number of reports that would seem to indicate that perhaps they do. Perhaps there is some sort of dog-like creature. I don't know. Perhaps it's something that can be truly explained, or just something that's been misidentified, maybe. But the lore goes back for more than 1,000 years that these creatures existed. Were they misidentified then, as they could be misidentified now? Certainly. I don't necessarily have a belief one way or another as to whether or not they existed. However, I think some of the stories that I find the most interesting are the ideas that these creatures could disappear and reappear. You see that in the skinwalker phenomenon. Certainly the story out of England in 1972, which, for those of you who've listened to some of my other shows, know that I look at this as perhaps this is some sort of the idea of the multiverse, that there's some other dimension, that these are some sort of dimensional creatures that appear to be a dog and human type of hybrid that have moved from one dimension into another briefly and then move back into their other dimension so that they cannot be seen. Perhaps there is something to that. If you believe in the idea of interdimensional beings, then this certainly could perhaps be an explanation for these werewolf sightings, this werewolf lore, and this phenomenon that still, even today, seems to persist. And while certainly many of the werewolf stories can be chalked up to, I think, people who are mentally ill, going back into medieval times, certainly, that these were people who were mentally ill, I believe that's the case. I don't know that we can completely dismiss the phenomenon as entirely myth. There would seem to be the possibility that there could be something here. That being said, I think it's best to leave the investigations and any definitive answer to those who are still working in trying to find the truth about some of these current day mysteries. The Beast of Bray Road, the Dogmen of Michigan, and of course in a similar area geographically, these stories are persisting. So, do I have an answer? No. But do I think that it's worth a discussion? I do think it's worth a discussion. I think that we need to kind of get outside the Hollywood idea a little bit, no matter how fun it is. But there does appear to be something going on. And whether it's people misidentifying, I don't know. But yes, there are people who are investigating, and perhaps maybe we can get some sort of definitive answer as to whether or not any of this is true in any way at all. So, at any rate, that is what I have for you this week. I hope you enjoyed the show. And as I said, I wanted to get into something a little more lighthearted. And for those of you who want me to get a little more serious, hang in there for a couple more weeks, and I'll be back to more of the brooding topics and that tend to take a little bit of a beating on you from time to time. But nevertheless, I will get into a little more of the conspiracy stuff, I think, going into November, certainly. Try to touch on some of those topics as well. But wanted to have a little bit of fun here for the Halloween season and try to lighten things up a bit. So I hope you enjoy the show. Once again, I welcome your feedback. Message me on any of the social media pages. Also, email me, webofconspiracy@gmail.com. That's 2 B's in web, because that's my last name. Webofconspiracy@gmail.com. Let me know how you feel about a money bomb. I would love your feedback on that. And then, let me know if you have any other ideas, opinions, topics you'd like me to do shows on. I'm more than welcoming to ideas and topics. I'd love to kind of get a variety going. So that being said, let me know what you think about these topics, and we'll go from there. But hopefully everybody likes this, and have a little bit of fun for the next couple weeks. And until next Friday, have a great week.